The game, unfortunately, displays lacking quality from here up until Heisenberg's factory. The enemy encounters are very throwaway, exploration is lacking, the missed potential really shows itself, the forced reliance on exploits, a limited number of new enemy types, lame boss fights, minus Beneviento because it has to be judged differently given its format, lack of files and additional lore to fleshing out the story, underutilized characters, miscommunication on the Duke's part, etc. This is about an hour's worth of gameplay if you're playing the game right. We meet the Hag again, once again talking in riddles and explaining that the crests of the four bloodlines can open the path Ethan seeks, which of course corresponds to the flasks containing the body parts of Rose. Why couldn't she be the one to assume the Duke's role of disclosing important information? Why couldn't she acknowledge Ethan's acquisition of the flask that contains a part of Rose, and then Ethan finds information pertaining to the winged key in the house with the red chimney? At least that would make more sense than having an imaginary character like the Duke advising him. Why would the Duke even advise him to go to the red chimney house? How would he know about the winged key? How does he know that the flasks contain Rose when Miranda has no reason to disclose this information to the Duke? What does he stand to gain by helping Ethan get Rose? Quite the non sequitur that could have been avoided had the Hag disclosed this information, because at least she has a motive for helping Ethan obtain Rose, since she's Miranda in disguise. Then again, why couldn't Miranda eliminate the Lords herself? If Heisenberg needs a huge army to deal with Miranda, then her lethality must be extreme. She could easily conquer 3 out of the 4 Lords with clever deception and sneak attacks. Heisenberg will be different because he understands the threat she poses. He already has a loathing towards Miranda, and he's already gone out of his way to prepare for her. But either way, Miranda could do all this herself. Why would she need Ethan for this? Why would she give the Lords the 4 flasks that contain Rose when she could have kept them for herself and used them when necessary? What purpose do they serve for the ceremony? None at all. I don't think the developers really thought that part through, but of course, you could go to any other Resident Evil game or any other game and find such discrepancies similar to this. So I guess it's something we're not really supposed to consider. We see the Umbrella logo engraved into the wall and also into the space where the Giant's Chalice goes. Ethan recognizes it, of course, though I'm guessing in the 3 years since the Baker incident, he hasn't heard much about Umbrella, which is why he simply says, "That looks familiar." Given that this village area is pretty much the inspiration of Umbrella's logo, I'm guessing we know where Oswald E. Spencer's medieval inspirations came from when he made George Trevor design his mansion, when he embraced medieval torture devices in art, and when he designed traps to deal with intruders. A real shame that such inspirations only served to make the mansion feel too arcadey and pad the runtime for Resident Evil 1 Remake, and made an already slow and clunky game even slower. But I digress. I should mention that at a point in my blind playthrough, I brought up the possibility of this game serving as the true origin of Resident Evil rather than Resident Evil 1 Remake, given how long this village has been around and the presence of the Umbrella logo. This entire village was around before Project W, which was Spencer's plan involving the development of the Wesker's children, which was indicated in Resident Evil 5. Boy, was I correct about that in the future, but I'll talk about that later. We move on to this bridge area, which is yet again another example of false messaging on the game's part. There are Lycans patrolling, and your first time experience fighting Lycans back in that dreadful village intro informs you of their poor designs and clunky, uncoordinated combat. You don't have much ammo after dealing with Alcina, and the Lycans are rigidly designed around having a tremendous amount of ammo. So what do you think I did for this sequence? I just ran through all of them because they were busy roaring or dropping from above to even get the chance to attack me. I triggered the animation of opening the door and they despawned. On Village's Shadows difficulty, for some bizarre reason, an armored Lycan and a bow and arrow Lycan are added, but they roar the same as the other Lycans, so the strat is still the same. Fighting them is an absolute waste of time, and they don't deserve to be respected if they don't respect you by being a well-designed enemy that's lethal for the right reasons. Once again, Why do the developers utilize this false messaging slash confusion to make these sections? And this confusion holds throughout so much of the game. Resident Evil Village's enemy encounters are entirely confused because they want to be like Resident Evil 4, where you're dealing with large groups of enemies in a dangerous environment, but they function like Resident Evil 1 Remake encounters, where you just run past them using exploits or other silly tactics that don't complement the section designs. There is a reason why they say that face validity is the most unreliable form of validity, and these sections are great examples of this. And we'll be coming across yet another section like this in just a few minutes. We meet with the Duke, who tells us to go to the house with the red chimney, and we get the chance to explore the village again, but with some new areas unlocked. I say new areas, I really mean just 2 houses and a shed that we can now access, since we have weapons. That's it. Don't waste time going to Luisa's house, by the way. None of those items are useful until you beat Moreau. There are also Samka patrolling around her house, so why bother making them seem like a worthwhile enemy to fight when they can be avoided later on? We go to the shed, solve a minor puzzle, deal with some Lycans in one-on-one encounters, grab the M1911 and the jackhandle, and then we get this. A bunch of Lycans are sitting on the rooftops, waiting to ambush you when you provoke them. Do you really want to deal with their running grabs, their poor hitboxes, their animation cancels, their gliding attacks, their overly sensitive off-screen attacks, their inflated HP, and their substandard stun animations, while also dealing with slow weapons and movement problems? No? So guess what? Repeat what you did at the bridge and run past them to despawn them, which will cause them to set up away from where you need to use the jack handle. What an expertly designed section befitting for a AAA developer. And if you need a disclaimer saying that right there was sarcasm, this review is not for you. I believe on Village of Shadows difficulty, they add a bow and arrow Lycan into the mix, but he is no roadblock, that's for sure. Before you use the jackhandle, you should look through this fence and shoot the lock on this door, which will serve as a useful shortcut. At least that's one way to reward exploration. But of course, in my blind playthrough, I didn't know about that lock, so I took the normal route and ran past the next 2 Lycans, ran past the armor Lycan because he's wasting his time in an animation, and then unlocked the door, which took a while, and I was at risk of taking damage. Getting on the ladder despawned the enemies, so why they were put there, I don't know. On Village of Shadows, a bow and arrow guy is placed at the top of the ladder, but he goes away when you start climbing the ladder, so what the hell does he add to the section? Nothing. I've never been so flabbergasted at enemy placements in a game before Resident Evil Village. If the developers designed the Lycans so poorly, and clearly not in a way that complements large enemy encounters, why do they bother doing large enemy encounters? Why do they make themselves look like fools? Almost like they didn't even comprehend their own designs. Why are they stuck between 2 Resident Evil mentalities that don't blend well together, yet they perfected such a blend with Resident Evil 7? Why are they acting like they didn't learn from Resident Evil 7? Why are they so confused? And again, the pandemic has no impact on brain capacity and common sense. Why did they make these nonsensical mistakes? I have never seen such fragmentation like this from any development team. We get a part for the Winged Key, get the well wheel, get some supplies, get some treasure, and we return to the Duke. He tells us about each of the lords and what lies ahead for us. A shame that he spun tales about Moreau's area. When describing Moreau and his area, he says that Moreau isn't the only thing living in those waters. Yet when you actually get to Moreau's area, the only new enemy type you actually encounter that, funnily enough, is not an aquatic BOW, is the Varkalak. But Varkalaks are interesting enemies used in throwaway encounters. Their potential is hardly realized in this game. And I think the Duke saying this line was something they included from the original build of Moreau's area, but the final build of Moreau's area doesn't gel well with the Duke's comment. More details on that later on when we get to Moreau's area. We then use the Winged Key to go to Donna Beneviento's area, along the way seeing some illusions, such as Mia expressing fear, and this is due to Ethan inhaling a pollen generated by certain flowers. Based on Donna's medical report, these flowers were infected by the Mutamycete and release the pollen when they come into contact with a signal-producing substance that is generated by Donna. I'm not sure why the Kadu would excrete this signal-producing substance, or what genetic data it must have taken in to gain such an ability. Can the Kadu take in the genetic data from plants? Maybe this is a fungal capability, which would line up with the idea of the Mutamycete playing a role in her Kadu's abilities. But then, what about the genetic data aspect? That's what's unclear to me. I mean, Donna's abilities mirror Evelyn's own abilities, only Donna is using the Kadu, while Evelyn uses her own body composed of E-type Mutamycete to do something similar to quorum sensing and the use of auto-inducer molecules in Pseudomonas bacteria to induce auditory and visual hallucinations in her victims. In fact, this does posit a thought. Assuming Donna's abilities were primarily due to the Mutamycete and not so much with the Kadu, when Miranda gave the connections Ava's DNA and some samples of the mold, did she mean to give them this variant of the mold, leading to Evelyn's abilities? Of course, it does beg the question of whether the mold that was given to the connections was derived from the Megamycete or not. Also, was Donna's mental illness brought about by this specific variant of the mold, or was she born with it? Because Evelyn also seemed mentally underdeveloped, but I can't confirm if she had mental illness or not. If she did, was it a result of the Mutamycete genome being implanted within her DNA during her pre-stage 4 development as an embryo? I ask this because if Miranda was aware of Donna's mental illness and the mold was potentially the cause for this, would she really give the connections this variant of the mold? In fact, why didn't Miranda give the connections a Kadu sample? Based on the way it's written in her journal, it makes it seem like she made the Kadu before meeting the connections, and the photos we see in her lab show that she was directly involved in the creation of Evelyn. She described Evelyn as a defect, which would imply that she was helping the connections with the creation of Evelyn for her own purpose of finding a vessel. Of course, we don't know when exactly the Kadu was created, but if it was created before Miranda met with the connections, and she was directly involved in Evelyn's development, then she could have given them a Kadu sample. I don't know. But the Resident Evil podcast team explains it as the connections wanting to try a different method for creating a BOW with the mold that didn't involve the Kadu or already living subjects. Rather than use another vector on already mature subjects, the connections would manipulate the subject at birth and shape their development into a BOW composed entirely of mold. Miranda was directly involved in Evelyn's creation for the purpose of seeing if Evelyn was a good vessel, while the connections used her to establish a baseline for mold-based BOWs. Evelyn carrying the mold since her birth would make the Kadu redundant, as if she adapted to it at birth, then her affinity with the mold would be high already. Introducing the Kadu into an embryo would always be fatal. These were things that Miranda understood with the connections methodology, which is why she didn't give them the Kadu. I personally don't think Evelyn has a very high affinity for the mold, and her affinity for the mold feels as low as Donna's affinity for the Kadu, yet they have similar abilities. The podcast team said that Evelyn not taking her treatments led to her supposedly low affinity, which makes sense, I guess. This story detail regarding Miranda and Evelyn is confusing, but returning to the main tangent, the Kadu's capabilities within Donna allow similar abilities to Evelyn when it comes to auditory and visual hallucinations. Donna can also separate and divide her Kadu, implanting each accessory Kadu into her dolls and giving her control over them at a long distance. We only see this demonstrated with Angie, and the dolls we see in her boss fight are all hallucinations, so I'm not really sure why Miranda even bothered acknowledging in Donna's medical report that Donna divided her Kadu among multiple dolls. I'm guessing with Angie and the range of motion she demonstrates in the trial scene, it's meant to be similar to the Armaduros from Resident Evil 4, where they are plagas that have grown to inhabit suits of armor fully, giving them human ranges of motion. Some of the plagas haven't grown completely, resulting in certain cases where Armaduros are only able to do one strike before collapsing. The parasites inside of the Armaduros probably survive without a human host by entering a dormant state to conserve their energy, only attacking when intruders are detected at the cost of a short lifespan. The Plaga type Cs, when not connected to a host, died after a very short duration. The average lifespan of a Cadou that's not connected to a host is never indicated, but maybe, given that the Cadou are infected by the mold, the lifespan is quite high. Donna is probably able to control what Angie does through a similar mechanism to the Las Plagas. As noted by Ada in Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil Damnation, the Plagas have an organ that senses certain sound waves at a certain frequency. It's how the dominant Plagas can control subordinate Plagas, and it's why the Lickers in Resident Evil Damnation were subservient to dominant Plaga users due to their acute sense of hearing. It is unfortunate that the whole idea of the dominant plagas not overtaking their host was a fallacy, at least for the genetically modified plagas we see in Damnation, as noted by Ada again. It is why Ottoman became a ganado, and it's why Leon had to shoot the plaga attached to Buddy's spine. Whereas with the Cadou, should the host display a high amount of affinity for the Cadou, they are able to maintain full control of the Cadou without any risk of harm to their bodies or minds. If not, they become a wide variety of subordinate BOWs, like with Lycans or Moriekas. I'm not sure if the site of Cadou implantation has anything to do with how a victim turns out, but maybe it does, given Heisenberg's infection and also with the soldats in his factory. With Donna, I'm not sure where exactly her Cadou is implanted within her, or when she bisected her Cadou and split it between her dolls, because she'd have to have done that before being implanted with it. It's unclear at this moment, but yeah, so many questions brought up with Donna and her Cadou in particular. Ethan makes his way to her house, where again, the same yellow flowers that are present throughout the house keep emitting this hallucinogenic pollen in response to the signal-producing substance generated by Donna. So in this hallucination, he's about to grab the rose flask from Angie when the lights go out. The room changes, and he loses his weapons. From here, we do a minor puzzle that gave me Bedroom DLC vibes during my blind playthrough. Before continuing on, I'd like to give my thoughts on the sequence and its execution. A lot of people love this part of the game and consider it the scariest part of the game, which I do understand, but I feel like their reasons are primarily surface level due to Ethan not having weapons, the intimidating music, the uncertainty as to what's coming, and the darkness. And yes, the music and the darkness are two things I like, but my reasons for liking the sequence go a bit deeper than that. This sequence represents a parent's greatest fear in thinking that their child has lost all sense of innocence and has been shaped into something terrible. Ethan's fatherly persona is given prime focus in this sequence, and it helps me bond with him more. The psychological horror focus of this sequence is also particularly specific to Ethan, as he's really the only Resident Evil character to have conquered biological and psychological horror. In fact, when thinking of the other Resident Evil characters, the entire time I'm just like, what are they doing right now? Aside from Chris, for all I know, they're probably lounging around in some bar somewhere celebrating their successes or wasting their time playing against each other in Resident Evil Reverse, thinking they've conquered bioterrorism and horror. But underneath their noses, an even greater evil was developing in the form of Evelyn and Miranda's surrogate families. In their hubris, they were completely unaware of what was happening, and Ethan Winters, a seemingly normal individual with no fighting experience, was discovering the truth hidden beneath the surface-level terrorist attacks and outbreaks that have happened between Resident Evil 1 to Resident Evil 6. In my head, I honestly viewed the other Resident Evil characters as fools for thinking they know better and acting like total blockheads. Of course, this is not actually the case, but I'd want it to be as such. There is no denying that Ethan Winters has gone through hell and high water in his first and second encounters with BOWs, without anyone saving his ass for a vast majority of time. And this sequence stirred these thoughts in my head greatly. This sequence has to be judged not based on the gameplay aspects, but mainly on its non-gameplay aspects. Obviously, it can be easy to feel impatient with this sequence, or feel that the developers should have given you some kind of skip option, but it is important to not let such a thought overwhelm you or cross your mind to an irritating degree. It is also important to know whether you should criticize it or not based on how it complements the overall foundation of the game. I can criticize the Sherry and Ada sections all I want in Resident Evil 2 Remake, or the intro and Carlos walking moments in Resident Evil 3 Remake, because such sections felt out of place in such games where speedrunning runs through the blood of those games, but not with Resident Evil Village. It's all a matter of feeling it out and analyzing a game deeply, with knowing when a game has speedrunning built into the core designs or not, and that's why I'm not harsh towards the sequence. This place is truly a residence of evil. It definitely fits Donna's methodology and modus operandi for how she would deal with her victims, as she's not the confrontational sort and doesn't have any of the physical strengths granted by the mold or the Cadou. And hey, compared to the other confused sections, broken enemies, and badly designed bosses like Moreau, this feels more tolerable. And on a final note, this sequence and Beneviento's boss fight can actually fit into the developer's deluded mindset of thinking this game is designed for Knives Out. But returning to the primary tangent, a large percentage of this puzzle involves disassembling the doll of Mia to gain access to items. I imagine this is Donna's cruel way of making Ethan feel uncomfortable while still adhering to the iconography associated with her doll-making skills. I do feel uncomfortable with this to a certain degree, especially when you take the scissors and cut off the bandages around the doll's torso and strip it bare. Only a sexual sadist would do something like that, so I can envision how uncomfortable it is for Ethan. Moving past that, the key elements to this puzzle all tie in to Ethan and his family in some way, whether it be the doll of Mia, the wedding ring, the music box from Mia's grandma, or the movie projector showing things specific to his family. So Ethan's hallucination is likely based around his current anxieties regarding his family, given fake Mia's incapacitation by Chris at the start of the game and Rose's kidnapping. I don't know if Donna is actually manipulating the events occurring during this moment, because if she was, she would have to be aware of Ethan on a very personal level, which can't be true. And also, why put Ethan through this kind of puzzle sequence if she wants to torment him through the baby enemy and also face him directly later on? It just seems like quite an unnecessary roadblock in her plan to take him down, but I digress. Throughout this puzzle sequence, there are moments where recordings of Mia play through a radio, which can't be actual recordings or lines of dialogue actually heard by Ethan during the 3 years between Resident Evil 7 and Village. Some of them can be explained off as memories of Ethan, but others, not so much. With regards to the other recordings, some of them can be explained off because they offer no compromising lore details, feel manufactured by an external source, and feel completely harmless in their implementation like a placebo. Other lines, on the other hand, present some confusing elements. Let me explain. So the first line of dialogue we hear is Mia exclaiming that Rose is kicking inside her stomach. This could be a part of Ethan's memories, so no problems there. The next line of dialogue is Mia saying she can't tell Ethan anything but this. Now, this is where confusion kicks in. Why would this play in a hallucination that Ethan is having? I know that the flashback cutscene after Chris captures Ethan is meant to link to this, but this doesn't change the fact that this line of dialogue could only play if Ethan heard Mia saying this. Donna couldn't possibly be controlling this. I doubt Mia would say this in Miranda's captivity. This doesn't feel manufactured, so why is he hearing this? It makes no sense. We then get a phone call from Mia, who's talking as if she's addressing Ethan directly or setting up a script for how she would talk about the secret to Ethan when given the chance. She says that she didn't want to keep it from him. She didn't want to lose him or their family again. She loves both Ethan and Rose so much, and that's why she kept it from him. Once again, more confusion kicks in. Why is this playing in Ethan's hallucinations? The contents of his hallucinations should only be based on what he knows or what he believes to be the case, and they should not sound like real recordings of something. But as we know about Mia, this was all true with her secretive nature and the fact that she knew Ethan was made out of the mold. That's the secret she wanted to keep. She knows that Ethan is made out of the mold, and that he died after Jack Baker caved his head in at the guest house. This major story device presents as a massive violation of lore, but is best reserved for later on in this review, alongside Mia's flawed reasoning for keeping this a secret. Admittedly, it's not Mia's fault, it's kind of a side effect of the BSAA stupidity, a stupidity made possible by very poor writing on the developer's part. Like, there is no excuse for this kind of irrational story device, since the director of this game, Morimasa Sato, was the lead writer of Resident Evil 7. Boy, will I have a lot of choice words to say later on. There are two more pieces of dialogue from Mia, but they're neutral quotes, of her crying for Rose and saying repeatedly it'll be fine, so there's nothing to extract from there. After getting the breaker key, we then encounter the baby enemy, which I'm guessing is a symbolic representation of Ethan's fears towards Rose becoming a BOW due to Miranda. It could also be Donna attempting to corrupt Ethan's image of what a real child is like, so whenever Ethan tries to think of Rose, his mind is linked to that image. I'm relating my own personal experiences to this, which fits a psychological horror-based villain like Donna. But the concept art for this enemy is phrased weirdly. The art director says that the baby enemy is a 2 to 3 minute old creature created from the doll of Mia. Why is this art director providing details that only have meaning in the real world and not in a hallucination? The contents in a hallucination are not realistic and can't possibly link to realistic details like that. Does this art director really think the entire sequence in Donna's house is real? You expect me to buy into that nonsense? Yeah, right. We escape the baby, although I question how Ethan feels leaving that creature down there. For all I know, he probably felt regret in allowing that perverted version of Rose to continue to be around, living a fate worse than death, and he didn't try to stop it. I feel like if we fought that enemy and Angie, it would have been mentally liberating for Ethan, almost like how in The Evil Within 2, Sebastian overcomes the anima and eliminates the part of himself trapped in STEM, which caused him to feel better mentally, like he was letting go of his initial traumas with STEM, which I thought was a cool idea for a character growth. Of course, with Ethan, maybe at this point in the game, it wouldn't make sense to introduce such a fight that feels befitting for the interim between the middle and ending of a game, so I'll let it off. We then fight Angie in a deadly game of hide-and-seek, which is befitting for someone like Donna who seems too attached to her childhood. You're in a time sequence where you have to stab her 3 times within a certain duration each time, otherwise the fake dolls will attack you. I think the fake dolls are meant to be an homage to Resident Evil 3.5, which was an early prototype of Resident Evil 4, where dolls would actually attack Leon, but it definitely came across as an over-the-top idea that was too Silent Hill in its nature. At least in Resident Evil 7 and Village, the psychological horror elements were implemented better into the grounded biological horror universe of Resident Evil, so I can tolerate these fake dolls. Weirdly, they don't kill you instantly, yet it takes them nearly 50 seconds to even initiate the cutscene of stabbing Ethan if he doesn't find Angie. Not much to really say about this sequence, as is the case with a lot of rudimentary psychological horror-based games, or in this case, a psychological horror-based sequence within a game. Boss fights aren't really fights, and the lack of weaponry as Ethan would only contribute to this simple sequence. People like Under the Mayo criticize the sequence to death, but judgments towards the sequence have to be different given the foundations for the sequence are steeped in psychological horror roots. Could it have been more? Sure, it could have been more, but to be fair, it could have been worse, too. And I think the developers understood that they had to make a sequence complementary to Ethan's lack of weaponry in the moment. Looking at it from a logical design perspective, it makes sense, even though it was going to translate as underwhelming. They had what they had, and they went with it. Enough said about that. Ethan returns to the real world to find that he was actually stabbing Donna, who crystallized upon her death. The weapon that Ethan used to stab Donna is nowhere to be seen, but his hand is bloody. I'm guessing it was just embedded into her head, and her gown was hiding it. He gets the next part for the winged key and the rose flask, and is able to leave the household. He also promises to Mia that he'll make things right, which I liked. I'm sure after being tormented by Evelyn in Dulvey, Louisiana, going through Angie's boss fight was nothing. Ethan managed to pull his own weight, and Chris didn't magically appear out of nowhere and save Ethan in a moment apropos to Barry appearing out of nowhere to save Jill twice in Resident Evil 1 Remake. Knowing the situations Chris has gone through, I doubt he would have handled Donna's hallucinogenic abilities. I will say that in my blind playthrough, it was very strange how we didn't really get a lot of details into how Donna's abilities worked during that entire sequence, so it came across as just accepting Donna's abilities as they were. All we had to go on for this entire house sequence was just the picture of the yellow flower, and how back at the gravesite before riding the elevator, the plants were glowing, which didn't warrant any real questions given the hallucinatory nature of everything. It's only when we get to Miranda's lab that it's explained, which I don't know how I feel about that. I get that to complement the idea of Ethan being victimized by his experiences, he has to not be aware of how the Lord's abilities work, but it ended up leaving an ambiguous taste in my mouth. The step process just came across as, oh, Donna has these abilities, Ethan brushes them aside, and he leaves. Just go with it. That's quite passive, and it left me hoping that the next Lords would be better explained during my blind playthrough. And with that, this concludes Beneviento's area. We return to the graveside area and the path back to the village. All of Donna's flowers have withered away because of her death, which sounds like something related to quorum sensing in certain bacteria, where an individual bacterium can affect the entire colony, even if the rest of the colony hasn't experienced the same conditions as the individual bacterium. The high population density serves as a variable in this case. Because Donna died, something akin to autoinducer molecules in quorum sensing triggered apoptosis in the population of plants exposed to her, and I'm guessing in her dolls as well. There is a household that has the W870 TAC shotgun and some other supplies as well. Morieka are coming out of the ground, so we progress forward outside of their leash area so they don't follow us. There is another household that has some supplies and the Luthier's key. I missed the TAC shotgun and the Luthier's key in my blind playthrough due to my previous experiences with the enemies forcing me to run. On Village of Shadows, when you're crossing the bridge, 2 bow and arrow lycans have taken the high ground to shoot you. This is a really dumb enemy placement. Not only is there barely any cover, but the lycans only get stunned from the shotgun at any range, and with a headshot from the sniper rifle. I usually just push past them and shoot one with the shotgun to reduce my chances of getting shot. I'm not slowing the gameplay to a jarring halt to deal with these crappy enemies. Proceeding onward, we return to the village area, and all those enemies we ran past have despawned. One thing I should talk about is back where you get the Luthier's key, there is a journal from Donna's gardener, Josef Simon, that talks a bit about Donna's history and Miranda. Donna had lost both parents and was afraid of others because of a scar across her face since childhood. She received Angie from her father and was adopted by Miranda on November 10th in an unspecified year. Josef was overjoyed that Miranda adopted Donna, which once again showcases Miranda's worship by the villagers. Between November 10th and November 27th, Donna was implanted with the Kadu and received her abilities. On November 29th, she instructed Josef to plant the yellow flowers in front of Claudia Beneviento's grave, which is why we see those flowers glowing in front of the grave. Through these yellow flowers, Josef was infected with the pollen and hallucinated that he saw his dead wife. He told this to Donna, who asked him to come to the house tomorrow, which is where he met his end. Interesting background details, though I questioned what happened with the Luthier. I also wonder if the Luthier had connections to Beneviento's family, because why would Josef have the Luthier's key unless they both had connections to the Beneviento family? I guess they could also be close friends and Josef is holding on to the key as a friend. The Resident Evil podcast team mentioned that it's unclear what the Luthier's connections were, but most likely, given that the village was small, many people knew one another. Of course, that does beg the question of how Heisenberg managed to abduct so many people for his Soldat army if the village population was small. But the Resident Evil podcast team said that Heisenberg robbed graves as well as abducting victims, so that makes sense. Back in the village area, the only thing we can really do is use the Luthier's key to gain access to a household that has an extended mag for the sniper rifle and some treasure, the passcode being the 5th birthday of the Luthier's daughter. Or we could go to a doorway in Ava's cemetery area and grab the stone slab to then use back at that giant gravesite where all the plants are. If you're playing the game the right way, you'll never need to go to that gravesite and get the treasure. I guess that's one thing I can give the game credit for. It isn't so forceful in making you go to the side areas to contribute to fundamental progress in the main story. I can't stand that about bad open world RPG games, where they level gate quests to a severe degree that forces you to do mind-numbing side quests to be the right level for the main mission. They only do it this way because they're afraid of the possibility of players not doing them because they want to. Any good open world game, or any game in general, should put faith in the player's choice in doing the side areas or side missions because players want to be immersed in the game or collect supplies as backup or to flesh out the experience. In the case of these optional treasures, they aren't so forceful despite this game being designed entirely around the merchant. Also, if you do go back to that gravesite or when you go to Otto's Mill when reaching the stronghold, you'll encounter optional bosses called Urias Drak, who work just like Urias, but they have an axe. Don't even waste time with these boss fights unless you're on New Game Plus. The payoff isn't worth it, and the fights happen with enemies supporting Urias Drak. In the mill, Samka will support them. At the gravesite, Morieka will support them. Trying to play these fights normally is just a mess. You get enemies blocking your way, you get Urias Drak doing attacks in improper situations, everything has so much life, the claustrophobic environment adds additional clunkiness to these giant encounters, and it's just better to use leash exploits to de-aggro the enemies and Urias Drak so you can shoot him freely. It's a shame because Urias Drak is the better Urias variant in the game because his hitboxes are better designed compared to Urias and Urias Straw here. What is unanimously bad between all variants of Urias is the claustrophobic environments, with many changes in elevation that make strategic movement and dodging cumbersome to utilize. This is like From Software levels of lackluster environmental comprehension in the placement of certain bosses within rooms. But moving on from that, the village area post-Beneviento doesn't offer much to do in terms of creative exploration. It relates back to a prior point that the main village area is just stale in terms of exploration. Each time we go back to it, none of the new avenues feel that substantial or offer much in terms of lore. It's hard to agree with the developers that the village is its own character when it's lacking in terms of content. I think one of the main contributing factors to this diminutive feeling is the actual scale of the village. When considering the actual scale of the main village area, not including the Lord's areas, you'd expect the new avenues for exploration to match that scale as well, but as shown with the main village area post-Dimitrescu or post-Beneviento, you spend more time retreading through areas you've already explored and exploring only one or two new buildings, which is incongruous with the actual scale of the main village area. This is not the case in Resident Evil 7. Because the actual scale of the Baker estate was small in comparison to the village, exploring new rooms actually held more weight. The balance felt right, but Village tries to give just as much as Resident Evil 7, and there is no weight behind the new areas because the balance is off. It's just basic math, and Village's calculations were off when designing the main village area.